Good morning, everyone. Imagine closing your eyes at night and embarking on a journey more profound than any voyage across the seas. Each night, as we drift into sleep, our consciousness traverses realms that science is only beginning to understand. Today, I want to delve into insights from a fascinating book that explores where our consciousness goes every night. This exploration isn't just philosophical. It's grounded in neuroscience, psychology, and experiential accounts. Most people think of sleep as a kind of shutdown, like turning off a machine for the night. That perspective, though intuitive, is fundamentally incomplete. What actually happens during sleep is far more nuanced. Consciousness doesn't vanish. It transitions, it shifts form, following a set of patterns that are more structured than most people realize. And understanding what's really going on during sleep is a key to understanding how the mind works not just at night, but in all states of awareness. Think about this. When you're awake, you're perceiving the world through your senses, interpreting data, making decisions, experiencing emotions. When you fall asleep, none of those faculties truly go away. They reorganize. The brain doesn't stop working. In fact, it becomes extremely active, sometimes more so than in waking life, but the activity is different. It operates within a different framework. That's why we dream. That's why, even in sleep, our sense of self is not lost. It's transformed. From a neurological point of view, consciousness during sleep moves through identifiable stages: N1, N2, N3, and REM. Each stage corresponds to specific brainwave patterns, hormone cycles, and levels of bodily repair. But these stages aren't just biological routines. They represent different levels of awareness, different expressions of consciousness. In the early stages of sleep, awareness fades gradually. You may still be dimly conscious of your surroundings, your breathing, even stray thoughts. As you move into deeper sleep, this awareness thins out, but it doesn't disappear. It just becomes less bound to your sensory environment. Then comes REM, rapid eye movement, where it gets particularly interesting. REM is where the brain lights up with activity similar to the waking state. It's when dreams are most vivid, when emotions are most intense, and when the boundaries between self and story blur. During REM, consciousness reemerges, but not in the logical, structured way we experience during the day. Instead, it becomes metaphorical, symbolic. The brain begins integrating memories, reprocessing emotions, solving problems indirectly. And here's the most fascinating part. This isn't random. There's a kind of internal logic at play. The brain isn't just wandering, it's optimizing, sorting, synthesizing. What that tells us is that consciousness isn't a binary switch, on when we're awake, off when we're asleep. It's more like a spectrum, a process, a system that adapts to the conditions it's in. And if you observe that system over time, if you log your dreams, your thoughts upon waking, your emotional states before bed, you start to see patterns. You start to see principles emerge. Sleep, then, becomes not just rest, but reflection. A nightly return to the drawing board where the self is restructured and prepared for the next day. One important takeaway is that the mind doesn't ever stop being you. It simply stops being the daytime version of you. At night, the rules change. The guardrails of logic and sensory reality fall away, and what's underneath surfaces. That's consciousness too. It's just the subconscious form. And the fact that the subconscious becomes dominant during sleep is not a weakness. It's a strength. It allows the mind to explore areas we can't access rationally. It gives us information we didn't know we needed. Now, in the pursuit of success, whatever that may mean for you, understanding how you operate under different conditions is essential. That includes understanding how you think, when you're not fully awake. When you're dreaming, when your conscious filters are off, because those moments can reveal your underlying principles, your true fears, your unsolved tensions. Sleep becomes a kind of performance review conducted by your inner self, one that you can either ignore or learn from. So what should we do with this understanding? First, respect sleep, not just as a health requirement, but as a functional part of consciousness itself. Second, observe it, track your cycles, pay attention to what you dream. Notice the emotional residue that sleep leaves behind each morning. That's data, unfiltered, unmanipulated data, from the deeper layers of your mind. And third, use that data, learn from it. Sleep isn't dead time. It's active, it's complex, and it's trying to teach you something about yourself. The more you study it, the more obvious this becomes. Sleep doesn't take you away from consciousness. It just takes you to a different part of it, a quieter, more mysterious part that often holds the answers you've been missing while awake. Ignoring that is like ignoring half of your operating system, and no one performs well on half a system. Sleep isn't the opposite of consciousness. It's an essential part of its full expression. And once you start to see it that way, you begin to realize just how little you've understood yourself until now. At some point, most people experience a moment in a dream when they realize, however briefly, that they're dreaming. It may only last for a few seconds before the illusion pulls them back in, but that brief awareness, that shift in perception, is profound. It's a state known as lucid dreaming. And what it reveals about the mind and consciousness more broadly is not just interesting, it's potentially transformative. To understand what makes lucid dreaming significant, you have to first understand what it represents. During waking life, we have a fairly consistent sense of reality. Our surroundings, thoughts, and choices seem predictable. Cause and effect behave as they should. In dreams, that structure collapses. Time becomes nonlinear, logic unravels. Yet when lucidity enters the picture, the conscious self, that same reasoning observer that operates in your daily life, emerges within that chaotic dream world and begins to participate. What's fascinating here is the reappearance of self-awareness inside a non-rational environment. That tells us something important. It tells us that the observer, that part of you capable of knowing and deciding, isn't limited to the waking state. It can be present even when your sensory inputs are shut down, when your body is paralyzed, and when the external world has been replaced entirely by internally generated imagery. In other words, consciousness doesn't require reality. It just needs awareness. Now, from a neurological standpoint, lucid dreaming is associated with increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the same region of the brain involved in planning, judgment, and self-reflection. That alignment matters. It shows that the brain can re-engage high-level cognitive functions while immersed in a completely fabricated environment. That opens up a different way of looking at what consciousness actually is. It's not strictly dependent on the physical world. It's dependent on internal processes that can operate independently of external input. Let's look at the implications. If you can be aware while dreaming, and if you can learn to direct that awareness, you gain access to a form of consciousness that isn't bound by the limitations of time, physics, or social structure. You're essentially operating in a sandbox version of reality where you can observe your thoughts and reactions in a pure form. There are no consequences in the conventional sense, which means there's no incentive to lie to yourself. You can't fake anything in a dream. What you see is what you believe at the deepest level, and that's where the value is. Lucid dreaming becomes a kind of simulation environment where you can explore your fears, ambitions, memories, and desires without the interference of external judgment. It becomes a mirror for the mind, one where your hidden beliefs and mental habits show themselves more clearly than they do during the day. From a learning perspective, it's an opportunity, an edge. Now, this doesn't mean you should become obsessed with mastering lucid dreaming as an escape. That misses the point. The real insight lies in understanding how awareness can reinsert itself into unconscious states, and what that reveals about your capacity for self-observation. The ability to recognize a dream while dreaming is like recognizing a blind spot while thinking. It shows you that the mind can become aware of itself, even when it's being deceived by its own stories. That principle translates directly into waking life. Most people walk through the day on autopilot, repeating routines, reacting emotionally, trapped in loops of behavior they don't fully understand, just like in a dream. But if you train yourself to recognize those loops, to wake up during them, you start making decisions from a different level of awareness. You break the script. You see the system operating beneath the surface. In that sense, lucid dreaming is just a training ground. It sharpens your capacity for inner clarity. It helps you build the muscle of reflection, of seeing yourself clearly even when you're immersed in confusion or false signals. That's incredibly valuable because life itself is filled with noise, with misleading narratives, with internal distortions. The better you become at identifying those distortions in one state of consciousness, the more effective you become in all states. So the takeaway isn't to escape into your dreams. It's to understand that awareness is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice. Whether you're asleep or awake, that ability to recognize where you are, what's real, and what story you're telling yourself is foundational. It's what allows you to navigate complexity with clarity. Lucid dreaming just happens to be one of the few times you get to practice that skill without the normal constraints. It's where the mind turns inward and reveals its architecture. And once you've seen that, you don't look at consciousness or yourself the same way again. There's a moment, fleeting, often unnoticed, when you're neither awake nor asleep. You're not fully here, but not quite gone either. It happens as you're falling asleep and again when you're waking up. These states are known as hypnagogic and hypnopompic, and they represent transitions, thresholds of consciousness. Most people pass through them without awareness. But if you pay attention, if you learn to observe those thresholds, you begin to understand something very fundamental: the way your mind creates reality. In these states, thoughts and images arise spontaneously. You might hear a voice say something without knowing where it came from. You might see shapes, patterns, even people, vividly and often nonsensically, and yet you don't question it in the moment. Your logical mind begins to loosen its grip. The filter that normally parses signal from noise starts to dissolve. What remains is a raw stream of mental material, memory fragments, emotional residues, unresolved questions, all surfacing in real time. What's fascinating is how honest that material is. It's not curated, it's not filtered by ego or dressed up to be socially acceptable. It's the unpolished feed of your subconscious, merging into your field of awareness before your rational mind gets involved. That's valuable, that's data. If you want to understand how your inner system works, what drives you, what scares you, what you're avoiding, this is one of the few times when the system shows its internal code without pretense. You're getting access to a version of your thinking that isn't trying to perform. There's no pressure to respond, no one watching, no reward to gain. It's just you with your unspoken thoughts coming into view. That alone makes it worth paying attention to. When you start observing these transitions regularly, you notice patterns. Maybe you always feel anxious in the moments before sleep, or a specific memory keeps coming up as you wake. These aren't random, they're signals. They're telling you something about the unresolved processes running in the background. And once you know what those processes are, you can start to deal with them more consciously, rather than letting them drive you unconsciously. This is something I've found over and over again. When you encounter any part of yourself that feels strange, irrational, or out of control, the best thing to do is to watch it carefully, not judge it. Not fix it right away, just observe. These early and late stages of sleep offer exactly that opportunity. You're still enough to notice things, detached enough to observe without reacting, and clear enough to carry what you learn back into the day. Of course, most people don't give these states much attention. They're too fast, too fuzzy, too easy to forget. But that's exactly why they're powerful. They bypass your habitual defenses. You can't game them, you can't script them, and you can't force them to say what you want. They just happen, which means they're honest. And honesty, especially internal honesty, is the foundation for any real improvement. The transition into sleep, for instance, often reflects the state of your nervous system. If your mind is racing, if you feel tension in your body, the hypnagogic state may be fragmented or jarring. That tells you something. It means you're carrying unfinished mental loops, and your system is still trying to process them. On the other side, the moment of waking, the hypnopompic state, can reveal what's been going on unconsciously while you slept. It might come through as a dream residue, a lingering feeling, or a sudden insight. What I've seen is that when you create the habit of gently paying attention to these moments, they become more vivid. Your mind starts treating them as important. You begin to recall more, notice more. And in that noticing, you start learning more about yourself, not from books or theories, but from direct experience. The raw material of your own mind becomes a mirror, and that reflection becomes actionable. This all ties into a broader principle. If you want to make better decisions, live more clearly, and operate more effectively, you need to understand how your internal environment works. These microstates, hypnagogic and hypnopompic, are windows into that environment. They aren't just psychological curiosities, they're diagnostic tools, indicators, feedback mechanisms. So the question becomes, are you using them? Are you aware of what they're trying to show you? Or are you rushing past them, back into distraction or sleep, without listening? Because ultimately, the more clearly you see yourself, the more clearly you can see the world. And these threshold states, quiet and subtle as they are, offer some of the clearest glimpses you'll ever get. When you're awake, you solve problems by gathering data, weighing options, running simulations in your head, and making decisions. It's a very linear process, constrained by logic, time, and attention span. But when you're asleep, especially in dream states, that structure breaks down, and in that breakdown lies a hidden advantage, because what seems like chaos from the outside is internally a different kind of logic. The mind is still solving, but it's doing it in a way that's not immediately obvious. Most people think of dreams as random stories. These are disconnected images without meaning. That's because they're looking at the surface. But if you step back and examine what dreams actually do, the patterns start to emerge. During dreams, especially REM sleep, the brain is incredibly active. Neural networks involved in memory, emotion, and association light up. And while your conscious mind is offline, the subconscious begins weaving together elements of recent experiences, past memories, long-held beliefs, and future worries. That process isn't random, it's integrative. It's sorting out contradictions, mapping unknowns, and looking for patterns. In many cases, the mind is testing scenarios, playing out what-ifs without the constraints of waking logic. In other words, dreaming is a sandbox for problem solving. It just doesn't present the answers in bullet points. It shows them in metaphors, symbols, emotional impressions. You don't wake up with a spreadsheet. You wake up with a feeling, a fragment of insight, or a clarity that wasn't there before. I've seen this again and again, especially in high-stakes decision-making. Sometimes, after days of thinking about a problem consciously, you'll go to sleep and wake up knowing what to do. You may not be able to explain it rationally at first, but you feel the alignment. That's your subconscious doing its work. It's been sorting and connecting ideas behind the scenes. This isn't mystical, it's neurological. The conscious mind gets tired. It has limitations. But the deeper layers keep going, quietly running background processes that shape how you think and what you choose. What's powerful about this is that it opens up a new layer of feedback. Your dreams aren't just idle byproducts of sleep. They're outputs of a deeper intelligence. They can reveal what you're avoiding, what you truly want, what you've misjudged, or what needs to change, but only if you're paying attention. The problem is, most people dismiss dreams because they're not packaged in a form that they're used to. They expect clarity, and dreams speak in abstraction. That's a mistake. Just because something doesn't speak your language doesn't mean it isn't communicating. In fact, the value of dreams is precisely that they bypass your usual mental defenses. They're not shaped by your self-image, your logic, or your conscious filters. They're shaped by raw association, by emotional truth. That means they can surface ideas or conflicts that you're not ready to admit to yourself in the daylight. And that's where their real utility lies. Dreams are brutally honest. They reflect your operating system without polishing it. So if you're stuck in a pattern, repeating the same mistakes, feeling unresolved, unable to move forward, your dreams might be telling you why. Not directly, but indirectly, through metaphor, through scenarios that echo your real dilemmas in symbolic form. The moment you start decoding that, really listening, you open up a feedback loop that can dramatically improve your self-awareness. In a practical sense, this means creating space for reflection. Write down your dreams, not because everyone is profound, but because you need volume to see pattern. Don't look for grand meanings. Look for recurring themes, emotional tones, familiar scenarios. Over time, you'll see what your subconscious is working on. And when that aligns with what your waking mind is working on, you get synergy. You start solving problems on two levels at once. The key idea here is that the mind doesn't stop processing when you sleep. It just changes how it processes. During the day, you think deliberately. At night, your mind explores freely. Both are necessary, but most people overuse the former and underutilize the latter. They rely only on conscious thinking and ignore the vast processing power of their unconscious. That's like running a business and never checking your back office. Sooner or later, things pile up. But when you integrate both, when you allow your conscious and unconscious systems to work together, you become significantly more capable of making decisions with depth and perspective. The path to clear thinking often runs through unclear territory first. Dreams are that territory, and if you respect them, not as prophecy, but as process, you start to solve problems in a much more complete way, because you're no longer relying only on what you know. You're also learning to work with what you haven't yet realized. The most important investment you'll ever make is the one you make in understanding yourself. Everything you achieve, every decision, every relationship, every system you build, flows from how well you know your own nature. And yet, most people go through life with a vague, often distorted sense of who they really are. They rely on surface-level traits, on feedback from others, or on narratives they've picked up along the way. But those are just projections. To truly know yourself, you have to go deeper. You have to look at the parts of you that aren't obvious, even to you. This is where the study of consciousness during sleep becomes not just interesting, but essential. Because when you're asleep, when the external world fades and your internal world becomes primary, you encounter a version of yourself that isn't filtered, isn't curated, and isn't pretending. It's raw and it's real. That part of you, the one who dreams, who reacts instinctively in subconscious states, who builds entire emotional landscapes out of memory and anticipation, that's you too. And if you ignore that part, you're operating with a partial map. You'll keep running into the same blind spots, making the same decisions, feeling the same frustrations without knowing why. So, when you observe what happens to consciousness during sleep, when you look at lucid dreaming, hypnagogic imagery, emotional residue in dreams, and the symbols that reappear, you're not just studying sleep. You're studying yourself. You're accessing a fuller model of your mind, and once you start doing that, the game changes. You begin to see that your conscious self is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the spokesperson, not the system. Beneath it is a massive architecture of mental models, emotional patterns, instincts, unresolved narratives, and behavioral loops that drive most of what you do. These aren't bad or good, they just are. But if you don't see them, you can't manage them, and if you can't manage them, they end up managing you. The implications of this are huge. It means that growth, real, sustainable growth, requires more than learning new ideas. It requires integrating what's already running inside you. You need to examine how you respond to fear, how you handle uncertainty, what your core motivations are, what triggers your defensiveness, and what you're still holding onto from the past. Most of these things won't show up in a spreadsheet or a journal entry, but they show up clearly in dreams. They show up in how your subconscious reacts when your guard is down, and that's the opportunity. Sleep becomes a form of internal diagnostics. You're watching the system run without manual input, and by paying attention, by capturing what you experience in those unconscious states, you begin to see yourself more objectively. That's the goal, objectivity, not just in the world, but in how you view your own mind. It's not enough to believe yourself aware. You have to measure that awareness through consistent, unfiltered feedback. And your internal experiences while asleep are some of the most direct feedback loops available. They're not biased by what people think of you. They're not shaped by what you want to believe. They're simply what is, reflecting back your current state of mind in symbolic form. And when you start seeing those patterns, not just once, but over time, you gain leverage. You begin to see where your thoughts come from. You realize which fears are outdated, which desires aren't really yours, and which habits you've unconsciously repeated for years. That insight creates space, and in that space, you find the freedom to operate differently. So, this isn't just about dreams. It's about using every tool at your disposal to get closer to truth. Because the more truth you can face about yourself, the more precise your actions become. And precision over time leads to extraordinary results. What I've found is that the people who go far, the ones who build lasting systems, make wise decisions, and stay steady under pressure aren't necessarily the most talented or intelligent. They're the ones who know themselves the best. They've made the internal investments. They've built a feedback loop that includes the conscious and the unconscious. They don't need everything to be perfect around them. because they've learned to navigate their own imperfections with clarity. That clarity is earned, and one of the most underutilized ways to earn it is by studying what your mind is doing while you're not looking. That's not abstract, it's practical, because the more you understand how you work, the better you'll be at managing everything else you touch. And in the end, that's what this is really about. Not theory, not sleep science for its own sake, but the daily compounding returns of knowing who you are and building from there. In examining the journey of consciousness during sleep, we're not just exploring a nightly routine, we're delving into the very essence of what it means to be aware, to exist, and to be human. This mysterious book offers a window into these profound questions, blending scientific inquiry with introspective exploration. As we continue to study and understand these nightly journeys, we move closer to comprehending the full spectrum of human consciousness. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, sleep well and dream deeply.